Hello and welcome to the Amargi Mosaic. I'm your host, Elif Sarican. Today I'm joined by an MP for the Dem Party, also known as the Equality and Democracy Party, Ceylan Akça. Welcome to the show, Ceylan.
Hello, Elif. Thanks for having me.
We're witnessing a pivotal moment for both Kurdish politics and the Kurdish people in general. In Turkey, there's been talk for some time of a renewed peace process particularly with the PKK, which has announced its dissolution after 40 years of armed struggle. Yet simultaneously, Turkish-backed Syrian forces are attacking the very experiment in democratic confederalism that emerged from Abdullah Öcalan's political thought, the autonomous administration in northeast Syria. This contradiction raises fundamental questions about Turkey's regional strategy and whether genuine peace is possible whilst Kurdish gains are being crushed elsewhere, or the attempt to crush them. So, Ceylan, you're also a member of Dem Party's Foreign Affairs Committee, as well as being part of the Free Women movement. You travel extensively throughout the southeast of Turkey, North Kurdistan, giving you unique insights into how people are responding to current developments, which we will discuss a bit today as well. Your party also recently sent a delegation to Rojava, and you're witnessing firsthand how these regional dynamics affect people's lives where you're based. The first question I do want to ask you is, we've got this extraordinary contradiction between with some of the developments that are happening. The PKK effectively dissolved itself, and as we said, there's talk of a peace process. Yet at the same time, we're seeing everything that's happening in Syria, the attacks on Rojava and the besieging of Kobani, the city that first territorially defeated the so-called Islamic State. As someone on the Foreign Affairs Committee, how do you read this?
Since the beginning of the latest talks into resolving this Kurdish question through peaceful methods, there have been many contradictions. This process started about a year and a half ago with a handshake from the leader of the Nationalist Action Party, the far-right party in parliament. And after that, a series of steps were taken by both parties. With both parties here, I mean Mr. Abdullah Öcalan, the PKK, and then the Turkish state. I should add here that the steps from Turkish state has been fewer than the ones taken by the PKK and Abdullah Öcalan. And in the last 1.5 years, we have seen several contradictions, not just what we see on the ground right now with Rojava, but that's also during these talks that started in December 2024, the state continued to impose trustee system on Kurdish municipalities. So about 10 municipalities that were democratically won by my party are still held by trustees based on bogus charges against our mayors. Secondly, prisoners who have completed their terms in prisons, serving more than 30 years, are still held in prison and forced to serve longer terms despite legislation telling the state to release them. Thirdly, the oppressive legal amendments continued. By that, I mean prosecuting people for free speech, prosecuting people for engaging in democratic protests on the ground. And lastly, is the occupation in Syria, the areas that Turkey has invaded since 2018 with the green light given from the Trump administration back then. And right now we're seeing a similar backlash or a similar return to similar policies, let's say. With Rojava, even though it appears like the HTS-led administration, the self-appointed president, Ahmed al-Shara or Jolani, is in charge of this operation, Turkey is helping with aerial observation and also drone bombings of Kurdish areas like Haseke, Kamishlo, Kobani, and so on. And Turkey is providing intel. Turkey is also providing funding for certain groups on the ground, like Sultan Hamza, Suleiman Shah, and groups that have been sanctioned by the UK and the EU for their activities that amount to war crimes. So on the ground, there are a lot of contradictions. And right now, people in Bakure, Kurdistan, where I am, the northern Kurdistan, they are absolutely disillusioned by these talks. They are saying that how could you talk about peace with the Kurds in Turkey, but wage a war on the Kurds in Rojava, but also engage in such talk that question the legality of the administration in Iraqi Kurdistan. So one of the contradictions that I want to point out is that at the beginning of this process, the demand from the state, the Turkish state, was the dissolution of the PKK, and the PKK did that. Then they started talking about YPG also having to dissolve itself, and they wanted SDF to dissolve itself as well. Now they are raising their hand and they're saying that PEJAK, the armed group that operates within Iran, they want them to dissolve themselves too. However, it doesn't even end here. Now they're questioning whether the KRG, the Kurdistan Regional Government, is a legitimate government. They're saying that that also is a burden in the consolidation of power in the region. And they've gone further. Some analysts, pro-government analysts, are saying that my party also needs to dissolve itself as part of the peace talks. So rather than dialogue between partners, mutual partners, this looks like one side asking for a full surrender of one. And since the beginning, we have given a different name to these talks that were in Turkey to resolve the Kurdish question in Turkey, but have implications for the rest of the region. We have called it Peace and Democratic Society. The state, on the other hand, insisted on calling this terror-free Turkey. But day by day, as the contradictions that I just mentioned, asking for repeated dissolution of certain groups, it looks like they want a Kurd-free region. And that's what the biggest contradiction is. Do they want Kurds to exist with their own political agency, or do they just want them to melt into submissive figures that have no say in political decision making? And that's where we are right now.
And I mean, as many people who would have followed, particularly some of the policies of Turkey, would perhaps analyze the Turkish state's domestic policies, which often has been, particularly in its 100-year existence as a nation state, been very much centered around actually the Kurdish people, is very connected to its foreign policy, and that often has meant it's connected to its regional ambitions. So what does this tell us about Turkey's regional ambitions, particularly if, one could define this or understand this as an attempt for a Kurd-free region and submission?
Turkey is one of the main forces that sell weapons and have defense agreements with African continent, mostly in those countries. Turkey has a military presence in Libya. It's providing military training and also equipment to the Libyan, UN recognized Libyan administration. However, that was always not the case. Turkey was involved with the other side, but when Turkey saw that the other side of the conflict was losing, they shifted sides, and they started supporting the UN-supported administration. However, you must have all seen the crashing of a plane in Ankara that carried Libyan officials, military commanders, the head of the Libyan intelligence. So all the people that were capable of uniting the Libyan state, the fragmented state, and make it a unified Libya, they all died on that plane. That was a huge blow to Turkey, and they have lost in Libya. And when it comes to Somalia, another place Turkey has a huge presence, Israel decided to recognize Somaliland, which Turkey deems as a separatist group in Somalia. And that's another loss Turkey had. Now more and more countries are recognizing Somaliland, and that's directly intervening in Turkish interests in Somalia. And in the East Med, we see that Israel, US, Greece, and Cyprus are making security and also economic agreements, and a new structure called 3+1 that makes them really strong partners, and also aim to reduce US reliance on Turkey in terms of military presence, which are now in Incirlik base. And these are all losses for Turkey. And lastly, this happened recently, the EU Commission leader von der Leyen cut deals with India in terms of free trade agreements. And again, recently we saw that EU cut new deals with Latin American countries in terms of free trade agreements, which are extremely detrimental to Turkish economy. They are losing, they are not EU members, and they rely on this customs union agreement with EU that needs to be renewed every year, but it hasn't been updated. And without this renewed or updated free trade agreement, the customs union agreement with EU, Turkey is really in a tight spot. So it has lost everywhere. And because it lost everywhere, it's looking for a win. And unfortunately, this 100-year-long allergy that it has towards Kurds, the Turkish state thinks that for it to win, Kurds need to lose. And that's why they're targeting the Kurdish gains in Rojava, where there was an autonomous administration, where multiple cultures were represented both politically, but also culturally. They were not just reduced to extras in the background when certain people are making decisions. And now Turkey is targeting that to have some domestic gains, because Turkish economy is not doing good. The Turkish government, the MHP, AKP, two conservative groups that are running the alliance at the moment, that the alliance that is in charge of the country, they are having domestic issues and they are trying to resolve that with some international recognition or gains. And that is through making the Kurds lose in Syria and appears that also in Iraq.
And I mean, for those who might not know, the Incirlik Air Base is located in the south of Turkey, which is a very key NATO air base in the region that is home to about 2,000 military personnel. And that's probably important to also get across, to understand that despite many contradictions, the enduring, particularly geopolitical significance of Turkey. And that actually leads me to my next question. You know, you spoke a bit about the contradictions between some of the actions of the Turkish state and the EU and UK, you know, in certain parts of the world supporting almost like opposing forces. But the EU and the UK both continue a very strong both trade and diplomatic relationship with Turkey. The UK in particular only last year in 2025 signed a multi-billion pound military, you know, an arms trade deal. What does this tell us about the contradictions that both the EU and the UK are able to accommodate? And you know, some analysts say that this is not actually these are contradictions on the surface rather than deep contradictions, in that there are almost, you know, tacit agreements behind closed doors of, you know, being able to kind of have influence in many sides of a conflict, and that's almost a tacit agreement between, you know, the EU, UK, perhaps the US, and the Turkish state.
Well, here we need to clarify a few things. Well, the huge arms deal that Turkey and UK did was in terms of UK selling their Eurofighter jets to Turkey, but they can't do that directly because of some unspoken sanctions, let's say. So instead, they had to get Qatar to sell their second-hand Eurofighters to Turkey. So it was a backdoor transfer of weapons. EU is trying to buy more weapons from Turkey. Turkey is one of the 10 arms dealer in the world. They are producing drones, and those drones are highly preferred by certain countries that have no access to US weapons. And EU, because of the tariff war that it's engaged with at the moment with the US, it is in need of buying drones elsewhere. And that's one of the deals that they have. And the shaking of NATO because of Trump's new stance on NATO is also forcing them to go down that road. So I understand where they stand on this one. But for Turkey, that is seen as an alternative for weapons, Turkey is trying to renew its very old Air Force fleet. They are under the CATSA sanctions because of Turkey's purchase of S-400s back in 2017, when right after the coup attempt in 2016, Turkey was very angry at its NATO partners, so it decided to purchase Russian S-400s. It purchased them, it put here, but that resulted in US imposing the CAATSA sanctions, which got Turkey kicked out of the F-35 fighter jet program. Now, Turkey is desperately trying to get back into that program, and that's why it's trying to negotiate or convince the current US administration to remove those obstacles that prevents Turkey from renewing its Air Force fleet. And unfortunately, we are seeing a world that is more and more militarized. Now everything is normal, so one cannot argue anything with international principles or standards or morals. It's just whoever has more power is doing whatever they want. And Turkey, I think, in this game is trying to play the strong hand, but I think they're also scared of their capacities at the moment, and they're trying to renew that by cutting the deal with whoever they see. But this is an unsustainable strategy for both sides, both EU and Turkey. Firstly, Turkey wants to be a member of EU, but Turkey is not doing what EU requires of it, like implementing court decisions that ordered Turkey to release wrongfully detained people, politicians, civil rights activists. It's also asking Turkey to amend its extremely oppressive anti-terror law, but Turkey is not doing that. So Turkey wants to do nothing and get everything without any consequences, and that doesn't work for EU. Even though EU is turning into an undemocratic entity, it still is an agreement. All those countries that are member of EU, they all agree that rule of law is important, and Turkey refuses to implement or impose rule of law in its own borders.
And I mean, this also sounds almost reminiscent of, some of Turkey's positions even during the Cold War era of trying to basically do nothing or almost play both sides or balance both sides and make maximum gains. I mean, also, from what you're saying, it also sounds like perhaps because of the changing positions of the US, both the EU and the UK are almost going through a bit of an identity crisis of what they want to be and how they might be able to take part in what seems to be the efforts to create a new world dynamics. And I want to move on to something a bit more specific. So we spoke about the process or the attempts for a process that have been happening in Turkey for over a year now. And Abdullah Öcalan remained central to this entire dynamic. He called for the PKK's dissolution from his prison cell. The PKK obliged and took those steps. But also his ideas about democratic confederalism is what built Rojava, and they're now under attack. How do you see Öcalan's role in this moment and in the context of some of the dynamics that you've already laid out?
I mean, firstly, he's the founder of the PKK. If you want PKK to lay down its arms, you have to talk to the leader of the PKK. Secondly, he is the philosopher that drafted this theory of democratic confederalism after carefully studying the structure in the Middle East. Thirdly, he understands the complexity of the Kurdish question. He understands that Kurds have been surgically divided in 4 countries in such a way that it makes difficult for them to ask for conventional things, have conventional demands. So he understands that this issue is an absolutely delicate one that requires surgical interventions. And that's how he had handled this process since 1992. There's a video of him from 1993, I'm sorry. He is in front of cameras and he's talking to the press and he's saying that I'm looking for someone to talk to, someone who would listen, someone who would understand this issue, and I'm trying to resolve this. And he's still there. He's still in 1993. He says the same thing, and he says, I'm trying to have people, partners, or someone who is on the other line, on the other side of the line, and is willing to speak. He also, I think, understands the current US Don't Row doctrine, where they want consolidated power in the Middle East, where they see democracy as an obstacle rather than something that allows sustainable administrations. They see the representation of multiple cultures as an obstacle from quick decision making. And Öcalan sees that as a problem, as an issue that will again send the region into a long conflict. And that's why he's saying that we need a new system in the Middle East. Nation states don't work. If nation states actually worked, all those countries that have been telling Syria or the rest of the all partners in Syria, all figures in Syria, to unify under a unitary state, they don't have unitary states. They have decentralized power in their own countries. Germany has federal system. US has federal system. UK has different decentralized systems. And they're telling Middle East that this system doesn't work. So to begin with, that doesn't, we find it hard to believe, and we're not convinced by what they tell us is the best way for us. So for the Middle East, decentralization is key, and Öcalan's theory in terms of that, in terms of ensuring sustainable decentralization is important, because if you want to force Alevis who were massacred since March, since this new HTS-led group took the administration, took control of the Syrian state, if you look at what they do to Alevis in the coastal area, if you look at what they do to Druze, and if you look at what they do to Kurds, how could anyone ask them to unify under this state that sees them as a threat and as just outcasts? So that's why it's important to listen to him. It's important to include him in the conversation to resolve the issue, not just in Rojava, in Bakure, Kurdistan, but it's also to resolve the issues in Rojava, in Iran at the moment.
And, you travel, as I said at the start, quite extensively across, the southeast of Turkey, North Kurdistan regularly, and are seeing how ordinary Kurdish people are responding to what they see happening around them, both within the borders of current-day Turkey and also in other parts of Kurdistan. And we also saw some extraordinary images of young people, both from, North Kurdistan and South Kurdistan, reportedly trying to cross borders to defend Rojava, whilst others are still watching the peace process with cautious hope. Can you tell us a bit about what the actual mood on the ground is right now? And, you spoke a little bit about it already, but are people seeing Rojava's crisis as connected to their own struggle? And how does the contradictions between peace talks at home and attacks on the Kurds in Rojava affect people's trust in the process?
In the previous talks, the fifth one, the one we are in now, which is in freezing state right now, it's in the previous one, the fifth one, the situation in Syria had a direct impact on the talks here, because the Syrian civil war broke out in 2011, and by 2013, different armed groups were forming. And at the time, Turkey was again talking to Abdullah Öcalan to resolve this issue. And I asked Abdullah Öcalan to make a call to the YPG so that they would join the Free Syrian Army and they wouldn't have their own defense system. Öcalan refused that. And when he refused that, by 2014, the talks started breaking out. They were just breaking down. And then in 2014, the siege of Kobani was a breaking point. Turkey was eagerly waiting for Kobani to fall. And that's when Kurds in northern Kurdistan took the streets and started protesting for several days. And it was such a mayhem on the ground that it cost the lives of 38 people. And Out of those 38 people, only the deaths of 5 were investigated, and those 5 were with the radical Kurdish Hamas-linked groups. Their deaths were investigated, and their deaths were used as a basis to jail Kurdish politicians later in 2019. And also start a closure case against my predecessor party, HDP, People's Democratic Party. And then by 2015, the whole process had completely fallen apart, and there were armed clashes in city centers in northern Kurdistan, displacements of 250,000 people, the jailing of thousands of people, and then soon after, in 2016, there was a coup attempt, and that crackdown on society just expanded to all sides instead of just Kurds, but Kurds were specifically targeted. Now, fast forward to now, we're again seeing Syria. Turkey is telling the Kurdish forces to just become an extension of these jihadist groups, these radical Islamic groups. And when they refuse to do it, Turkey is again engaged in the same kind of attitude that it was back in 2014. Now, what we see on the ground is that people are extremely emotionally disillusioned by the state. They have lost hope, or they are very close to losing all hope to coexist here in this land, not just with Turks, but with Arabs as well, because the current war in Rojava is raising this question, or increasing the risk of a Kurdish-Arab conflict, but also a Kurdish-Turkish conflict. And that's what Öcalan has warned since 1993. He's saying that we're going there, we're already in it, and there's a way to stop it. Now, there are non-stop protests at the border with Kobani, the border with Kamishlo. People are on watch. They have made attempts to cross. During one of those attempts, a young man named Diyar Koç in his 20s was detained by security forces. He was accused of downing a Turkish flag, where there's no proof that he had done so. They have beaten him so horribly that he had a brain hemorrhage. And then when he was still in life support, they put him under pre-trial detention. They unplugged him from critical life support system. They put him in jail in Mardin, and when that jail refused to receive him because they saw the risk of him dying, they sent him to Diyarbakir. In Diyarbakir, they sent him to the hospital in Diyarbakir, and they don't think they're equipped. They have the capacity to treat him. And now that young man, who has been sentenced to death by Turkish judicial system, is in an Ankara hospital trying to hold on to life. At the same time, people are circulating videos of them braiding their hair in support of Kurdish women who have been slain by jihadist ISIS-linked groups, who cut their braids and then wave it in front of cameras and saying that this is from a haval. And then Turkey detains people who braid their hair and say that braiding hair is making terrorist propaganda. At the same time, us MPs, we receive phone calls from unknown numbers that tell us that they are a paramilitary group and we will soon find bullets in our heads. So it's completely back to 2015, 2016. Our media accounts are being blocked. The social media accounts of certain media groups like Mesopotamia Agency or Gen News, the ones that report without state oppression or without state control, they are being blocked. And it's back to trying the same method to resolve this 40-year-long question. But right now, the Kurds are looking at Kurds in Iran getting killed by the regime. They're looking at Kurds in Rojava being massacred by Turkish drones, but also with the tanks of Turkish-Syrian state that are being equipped by Turkey. And this is creating such disillusionment that it will be soon impossible to fix or mend and tell people that it's okay and we could go back to talking. And the state doesn't see this threat. They don't see that this is pushing us towards I'm afraid of even saying it, but this is pushing people towards a complete disengagement from each other, a division.
And, many, kind of veteran Kurdish politicians have also already said, essentially, this is the last generation you can make peace with, in a way that it's the last chance. I also want to ask you, as someone who's a part of Teja, the Women's Movement, how are Kurdish women in particular responding to, both seeing the women's revolution in Rojava under attack and the legitimization of the ISIS mindset that they so that they so determinedly fought against, and also the impacts on a possible peaceful process and peaceful resolution within the borders of Turkey, because as many would know, particularly organized women, Kurdish women, have been the biggest advocates of a peaceful resolution.
During the conflict that had just gotten worse since the beginning of January, there have been some breaking points for Kurdish women. And I think the first one was when we saw HTS militia throwing the body of a Kurdish woman from a building. We are not sure if she was alive or dead when that happened. The second one was when they were making videos of these Kurdish women saying that they have sex slaves for Abu Amsha, the man who is funded by Turkey and is involved in the prostitution, the killing, the rape of women in Afrin that was occupied by Turkey. And Abu Amsha has been integrated into the Syrian army. And this is the kind of army that Turkey and other forces, the Western forces, are telling Kurdish forces to integrate into, where rapists have official positions. And the other one is that moment where this militia waving the braid of a slain Kurdish woman. And lastly, the first thing these groups did when they took over Raqqa was demolishing this woman fighter's statue. So it looks like what angered them the most during these more than a decade-long utopia in Syria was women's representation, women's inclusion, and women's revolution. And that's why here we, as the Kurdish women's movement, we stand by this women's revolution, Rojava's women's revolution, and we are in cooperation with Turkish feminists as well, who also have initiatives where they say we need peace. And because we need peace, we are going to be in solidarity with our Kurdish sisters. And from here, we're trying to build an international alliance between women as well. Kurdish women have several memberships to entities in the Middle East, in Asia, in Europe, and we're activating all those links again and build this strong stance from women who also say that revolution is also my revolution, and I'm standing by that. Because if we do nothing and wait for Shara-led, the self-appointed president, Shara's administration to take full control, it looks like they're not just gonna be content with issuing decrees banning women from using makeup during work hours, but they also announced plans that they will call women to act accordingly with Sharia law, taking the black veil and also living by those rules. And if that happens, that means the omission of women from all political space, whereas in the autonomous administration, women were or are still holding co-chair positions, and they have equal representation and equal say, just like men. That's very important to us.
And your party, Dem Party, also recently sent a delegation to Rojava after the escalation of everything we've spoken about. What did they report back about the situation there? And does the delegation's experience change how Dem Party approaches the peace process within Turkey, knowing what's happening to not only Kurdish people individually, but the systems that the Kurdish people have built just across the border?
Well, but the first impression I heard from the delegation was that they understood how shallow, how meaningless those artificial borders were. Because if you want to go to Kamishlo, you just go to Nusaybin and it's walking distance. If you just walk, you're in Kamishlo. However, because of World War I, because of the borders that were drawn in 1920s, you have to travel first to Iraq, then from Iraq, you have to go to a certain border gate, the Samalka, and then from there you can cross. And when they were in Kamishlo, they were able to see the lights in Nusaybin, and they said that particularly our co-chair, who is also an Arab Alevi woman, the co-chair of my party, Tulay Hatimoğulları, she wrote a very heartful article, kind of an op-ed about her impressions in Rojava, in Kamishlo. And she said, this is like another room of a house. One cannot argue that these are separate countries or separate people or separate states. These are cousins. These are people who have the same DNA cycle. So whoever tells you that these are different people and that we should be enemies of them are just enemies. These are the enemies of humanity. And she was talking about how they are looking from Kamishlo to Nusaybin for a beacon, for hope, and that they think they are hopeful that the reaction from Bakure Kurdistan is going to save them as well. It's going to be a good factor in a peaceful resolution to their issues at the moment. And the delegation that my party sent was also quite colorful. With colorful, I mean it had representation from a Turkish woman, from a Turkish Anatolian woman who is fully Sunni, who has no Kurdish blood in her, but she's a socialist, and she was part of that delegation. The other one is a fully Kurdish man. One is an Arab woman, an Arab Alevi woman, and they were all on the ground to be in solidarity with people of Rojava who were Arabs and Kurds and Syrians and Yazidis who all want to coexist and who don't want to fight, but who also say that they will fight if the war is imposed on them. So for them, the way they told us about it, it was quite inspirational to see how mobilized everyone was in Haseke, in Kamishlo, how they were just ready to fight for what they have built. And that gives us a lot of courage here in Bakure Kurdistan, in northern Kurdistan, to be on the street and resist to the police violence on the street that is telling us that we cannot advocate for a free Rojava.
And I suppose, what you've just laid out is an answer in and of itself to the some of the people that are claiming that, the attempts at, fraternity or the siblinghood of peoples is in a way what has caused this, or this represents a failure of that. And it sounds like, what you've just described is an answer to that, right?
Yeah, definitely. And that is the answer. But regardless of what the reality on the ground, we see statements. One was on 27th of January by, I think, UK, Germany, France, US, and I don't remember the other country, but there was one more that released a statement, and they were given some fake moral lessons to the parties of this war in Syria at the moment. And one was they were talking about how combating ISIS is key and main objective, but none of them talk about how many ISIS prisoners were holding citizenships of their own countries. They did not talk about their failure in repatriating their own jihadists, but they are telling the SDF to handle them for them, while also being cautious at this war and avoid any hostilities. Then they keep saying, we urge all parties to be cautious and to respect this and that, when it's one party to this war that is the aggressor, that is violating the ceasefire, that is imposing a completely unacceptable attitude that disregard any chance for coexistence. And they keep trying to whitewash this regime. They say that they urge all parties to ensure a unitary and sovereign Syria when they are not unitary states. So it's just lots of moral lessons that are not followed by them, not even moral lessons. These are not moral lessons. And they, instead of issuing or releasing these statements that are completely dead tone and have no connection to reality, they should also send delegations on the ground to see what people in Haseki and Kamishlo are saying, in Kobani are saying. In Kobani, when 500,000 people are circled and have no water, no gas, children are freezing to death. We have documented deaths of at least 6 children, and this is what they should focus on instead of using tone-deaf statements like urging all parties to stop the hostilities.
Thank you so much for your time and insights, Ceylan. I'm sure, like myself, many people listening to this will learn a lot. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me again and giving me this platform.
Thank you. And that's it for today's episode of the Amargi Mosaic. Until next time, take care.